I was standing in my own kitchen when my mother casually mentioned they'd already contacted the realtor about selling my grandfather's country house. The house where I'd spent every summer of my childhood, where I'd planned to raise my own kids someday, where I'd been paying the property taxes and maintenance costs for the past 3 years while living in the city. She said it so matter-of-factly, like discussing weekend grocery plans, that for a moment I thought I'd misheard her. My sister Delilah needs a down payment for that condo downtown, and this is the fastest way to get her the money she needs. The coffee mug slipped right out of my hands and shattered across the tile floor, but my mother just kept talking about square footage and market values like I wasn't even there. That's when I realized they'd never seen me as anything more than a caretaker for something that was never really mine to begin with. My name is Natalia Brennan, and I work as a claims investigator for Midwest Insurance Solutions. Most mornings you'd find me in our downtown office, pulling apart insurance fraud cases piece by piece. I've always been good at spotting when people lie about what really happened. The job taught me to look at documents, cross-reference dates, and find the truth hiding behind someone's careful story. After work, I'd drive 40 minutes north to check on my grandfather's old country house. 3 bedrooms, wraparound porch, sitting on 2 acres of oak trees. Grandpa Joe left it to the family when he died 5 years ago, but somehow I became the one handling everything. Property taxes, fixing the leaky roof last spring, keeping the heat on during winter so the pipes wouldn't freeze. My parents lived in the city and rarely visited, but they never complained when I handled the bills. I loved that place. Saturday mornings I'd sit on the back porch with coffee, watching deer wander through the yard. The house still smelled like Grandpa's pipe tobacco in the den. I kept his old fishing gear in the basement, thinking maybe someday I'd have kids who'd want to learn. The place felt like home in a way my downtown apartment never did. Every month I'd write a check for the property insurance, utilities, and township taxes. Never asked my parents to split the costs because I figured I was the one using it most. I was building something there, planning something. The house was my connection to family history, to quiet weekends, to a future I could actually picture. If this story hits home, make sure you're subscribed. We tell these for a reason. Looking back, the signs were always there. My sister Delilah had been living with our parents for 2 years after her divorce, supposedly saving money for her own place. But every family dinner, the conversation somehow turned to her needs. Mom would mention how hard it was for a single woman to get approved for a mortgage. Dad would shake his head about rental prices downtown. I remember one Sunday dinner last fall where Delilah spread real estate listings across Mom's kitchen table. She'd circled 3 condos in red ink, all priced between $200,000 and $250,000. Mom leaned over her shoulder, pointing at square footage numbers and talking about good investment potential. Dad mentioned something about helping with the down payment if needed. I was clearing dishes when Delilah looked up and asked if I thought the country house was worth much these days. Just casual, like asking about the weather. I told her I'd never really thought about selling it. The conversation moved on, but something in her tone stuck with me. Like she'd already been thinking about it for a while. Then there was the time I found Dad walking around the property with a notebook, writing down measurements and taking photos with his phone. He said he was just documenting things for insurance purposes, in case anything ever happened. I believed him because why wouldn't I? But now I realize he was probably getting it appraised, figuring out what it might bring on the market. The betrayal wasn't one big moment. It was dozens of small ones, building up over months. Every time I mentioned fixing something at the house, they'd suggest maybe it wasn't worth the expense. Every time I talked about my plans for the place, they'd change the subject. They were already planning to take it away from me, and I was too trusting to see what was happening right in front of me. That morning in my mother's kitchen changed everything. I'd stopped by before work to drop off some old photo albums I'd found in Grandpa's closet. Mom was making coffee and chatting about normal things when she mentioned calling Heritage Realty about listing the house. She said it like it was already decided. Like the 3 of us had sat down and agreed this was the best move for everyone. When I asked what she meant, she explained that Delilah had found the perfect condo but needed $40,000 for the down payment. Selling Grandpa's house would give them enough to help her out and still have money left over for everyone. The coffee mug hit the floor and broke into 4 clean pieces. I stared at the brown liquid spreading across the white tiles while Mom kept talking about market conditions and timing. She mentioned they'd already had someone come look at the house last week. A preliminary assessment, she called it. They'd done this behind my back while I was at work, paying bills for a place they were planning to sell without even asking me. I bent down to pick up the ceramic pieces, my hands shaking slightly. Mom handed me paper towels and continued explaining how the money would be divided. A third for each of us, she said. Fair and square. But nothing about this felt fair. I'd been the only one maintaining the property, the only one who actually spent time there, the only one who saw it as more than just an asset to be liquidated. When I asked about my opinion on selling, Mom looked genuinely confused. She said of course they wanted my input, but Delilah really needed help, and this seemed like the obvious solution. The house was just sitting there most of the time anyway, she said. It's not like anyone was really using it. That's when I realized they'd never understood what the place meant to me. To them, it was an empty house generating expenses. To me, it was the foundation of everything I wanted to build. They saw square footage and market value. I saw Saturday mornings and future memories, and the only place that felt like home. I called in sick to work that day and drove straight to the country house. Sat on the back porch for hours, just staring at the oak trees and feeling like everything I'd worked for was slipping away. The anger was there, but underneath it was something deeper. A sense that I'd been blind to my own family's priorities for years. I walked through every room, remembering what I'd fixed and what I'd planned to fix. The hardwood floors I'd refinished myself 2 summers ago. The bathroom where I'd replaced all the fixtures. The basement where I'd organized Grandpa's tools and workshop area. I'd put thousands of dollars and hundreds of hours into this place, and they wanted to sell it to fund my sister's condo purchase. The worst part was realizing how carefully they'd planned this. The measurements, the casual questions, the real estate research. They'd been working on this for months while I continued paying bills and making improvements like some kind of unpaid caretaker. I'd been so focused on preserving Grandpa's legacy that I'd missed them preparing to auction it off. But sitting in Grandpa's old recliner that afternoon, I remembered something he used to tell me when I was little. He'd say that some people see what things are worth, and other people see what things are worth fighting for. The difference, he said, was knowing which battles matter enough to fight smart instead of just fighting hard. That's when the idea started forming. I wasn't going to argue with them or make emotional appeals about family history. I was going to use the skills I'd learned as an insurance investigator to look at this situation the way I'd look at a fraud case. Find the facts, follow the paper trail, and see what story the evidence actually told. I started with the legal basics. Grandpa's will was clear. The house belonged to all 3 of his children equally, which meant my parents and their brother Uncle Michael each owned a third. But the will also specified that any major decisions about the property required unanimous agreement from all living beneficiaries. Uncle Michael lived in Arizona and rarely talked to my parents. I called him that evening and explained what was happening. He was surprised to hear about the sale plans because nobody had contacted him about it. More importantly, he wasn't interested in selling. He'd been hoping to use the house for summer vacations when he retired next year. That gave me leverage, but it also created problems. My parents would eventually figure out they needed Michael's signature and would pressure him to agree. I needed something stronger, something that would make selling impossible regardless of family votes. I spent the next week researching property records at the county office. That's when I discovered something interesting. 3 years ago, when I'd started paying the property taxes directly instead of routing money through my parents, the county had sent me a form asking about tax exemption eligibility. I'd checked the box for family agricultural use because the property was over 2 acres and we occasionally let a neighbor graze horses on the back section. The agricultural exemption had reduced our property taxes by about 60%, saving us roughly $2,000 per year. But I'd never told my parents about it because they weren't involved in the tax payments anyway. The exemption paperwork was all in my name as the person responsible for agricultural use of the land. Here's where it got interesting. The county's agricultural exemption rules stated that if the property stopped being used for farming or livestock purposes, the owner would owe back taxes for the previous 5 years plus penalties. Since the exemption had been active for 3 years, selling to a regular homeowner would trigger a back tax bill of approximately $12,000. But there was more. The exemption could only be transferred to a new owner if they continued agricultural use and filed proper paperwork within 30 days of purchase. Most condo buying families wouldn't want that complication, which would significantly limit potential buyers and reduce the sale price. My first plan was to simply mention the tax situation and let that discourage the sale. But when I brought it up with Mom, she just said they'd pay the back taxes out of the sale proceeds and move forward anyway. The condo was worth more to them than the hassle. That's when I realized I needed to think bigger. I spent 2 weeks researching everything I could about property sales, agricultural exemptions, and family inheritance law. The more I learned, the more I understood how to protect not just my interests, but the house itself. I scheduled a meeting with a real estate attorney, explaining the situation as a property dispute between family members. The lawyer confirmed what I'd suspected. As long as Uncle Michael refused to sign, the house couldn't be sold. But she also mentioned something I hadn't considered. Since I'd been the sole person paying taxes, insurance, and maintenance for 3 years, I might have grounds to claim adverse possession or at least compensation for improvements made to jointly owned property. More importantly, she explained that the agricultural exemption created a cloud on the title that would require resolution before any sale could proceed. Since the exemption was filed in my name as the agricultural user, I would need to sign paperwork releasing the exemption or transferring it to new owners. That gave me the final piece I needed. I drafted a letter to my parents, Uncle Michael, and the real estate agent they'd contacted. The letter explained that I would not be signing any documents to release the agricultural exemption and that I would be filing a formal claim for reimbursement of all expenses I'd paid for property maintenance over the past 3 years. I also mentioned that I'd be exercising my right as a joint owner to place a formal objection to the sale with the county recorder's office. This would create a public record of the ownership dispute that would appear in any title search, making the property essentially unsellable until the dispute was resolved through legal proceedings. The meeting happened at Mom and Dad's kitchen table on a Saturday morning. I brought copies of every tax payment, insurance bill, and maintenance receipt from the past 3 years. The total came to just over $18,000 in expenses I'd paid alone. I handed them the letter and watched their faces change as they read it. Dad looked confused at first, then angry. Mom kept asking if I was really going to sue my own family over money. But I wasn't suing anyone. I was just protecting my legal rights as a joint owner of property I'd been maintaining at my own expense. The real estate agent had to withdraw the listing. The title company confirmed that the ownership dispute and agricultural exemption issues made the property unmarketable until resolved. My parents would need to either pay me back for 3 years of expenses or abandon the sale entirely. It took 6 weeks for everything to settle down. My parents eventually realized that fighting me legally would cost more than just abandoning their plans to sell. Uncle Michael supported my position, especially after I explained how much money I'd been spending to maintain his inheritance while he lived across the country. The compromise we reached was simpler than anyone expected. I would buy out my parents' share of the property at fair market value, minus the $18,000 I'd already spent on maintenance. Uncle Michael agreed to sell me his third as well, since he was planning to retire in Florida instead of Arizona. By Christmas, I owned the country house outright. The first thing I did was set up a proper workshop in the basement, using some of Grandpa's old tools I'd been afraid to touch before. It felt different knowing the place truly belonged to me, knowing I could make long-term plans without worrying about family meetings and majority votes. Delilah eventually found a different condo and got approved for a loan with a smaller down payment. My parents were disappointed about losing the windfall they'd counted on, but they couldn't argue with the legal reality of the situation. Sometimes protecting what matters requires playing by the same rules the other side is using. I still drive out to the house most weekends. Still sit on the back porch with coffee, watching deer in the yard. But now when I look at the place, I see something I actually own instead of something I'm just taking care of for other people. The difference is bigger than you might think. The strangest part is that I don't think my parents ever understood why I fought so hard for that house. To them, it was always just about money, my share versus Delilah's needs versus practical considerations. They couldn't see that some things are worth more than their market value, that some battles are worth fighting not because you're angry, but because you're protecting something that can't be replaced. I learned that trust works both ways in families. I'd trusted them to consider my feelings about the house, but they'd never trusted me enough to discuss their plans honestly. Maybe if they'd approached me differently, we could have found a solution that worked for everyone. But once they decided to go around me instead of through me, the outcome was inevitable. The house sits quietly among the oak trees, patient and permanent in a way that people rarely are. Sometimes I think Grandpa would have enjoyed watching me outmaneuver the rest of the family using nothing but paperwork and property law. He always said the best revenge is making sure nobody can take away what belongs to you in the first place.